I should have known that the dead would not remain silent on my wedding day. The moment I stepped into the ancient chapel of Ravenshollow Manor, I felt her presence like ice against my skin, though the September afternoon burned with unusual warmth. The Gothic sanctuary stretched before me like a cathedral from my darkest dreams, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Centuries of prayers had soaked into these stones, along with confessions, secrets, and sorrows that no amount of holy water could cleanse. The very air tasted of old incense and older sins, heavy with the weight of all the souls who had knelt here before me, seeking absolution that perhaps never came. My gloved hand trembled against Papa's arm as we began our slow procession down the aisle, my ivory silk gown whispering secrets to the stone floor beneath. The dress had been crafted by London's finest seamstresses, its bodice embroidered with pearls that caught the light like teardrops, its train flowing behind me like liquid moonlight. Each step sent ripples through the delicate fabric, and I could hear the soft rustle of my silk stockings, the gentle creak of my corset with each careful breath. The guests rose in a rustling symphony of taffeta and wool, their faces blurring into a sea of expectant smiles. But my eyes were fixed on only one figure at the altar. Edward Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, stood magnificent in his mourning coat, his dark hair gleaming in the filtered light that streamed through stained glass windows older than memory itself. The windows depicted scenes of martyrdom and redemption, their jeweled colors casting patterns across the chapel floor like spilled wine. He was everything a woman could desire in a husband, titled wealthy, devastatingly handsome, and mine, or so I believed. His profile was carved from marble perfection, his jaw strong and determined, his bearing that of a man born to command. When he had proposed 3 months prior in Mamma's rose garden, I thought myself the most fortunate woman in England. Papa had been beside himself with joy at the match. "Catherine, my dear," he had said that evening, his weathered hands shaking as he poured himself a generous brandy, "this union will secure everything I have worked for. The Ashworth name will stand alongside the greatest families in the realm." His pride had been infectious then, and I had allowed myself to dream of ballrooms and country estates, of children who would carry noble blood in their veins. Now, as I approached the altar where that dream was to be made manifest, I wondered why my heart felt so heavy with foreboding. But as I drew closer, my breath caught in my throat like a trapped bird. There, beside my intended, stood another woman. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, its fabric so rich it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style I recognized from portraits dating back decades, crowned with a delicate tiara of sapphires and diamonds that sparkled with an inner fire. Her skin held the translucent quality of moonlight on water, pale as porcelain, yet somehow luminous, as though lit from within by some otherworldly flame. When she turned to look at me, her eyes were pools of such profound sadness that I nearly stumbled, deep blue wells that seemed to hold the weight of unspoken tragedies. Most disturbing of all, her pale hand rested possessively upon Edward's arm, her fingers curved with the intimacy of long familiarity. She wore a wedding ring, its gold band gleaming against her ghostly skin, and when the light caught it just right, I could see an inscription etched into the metal, though I could not make out the words from this distance. Edward seemed utterly unaware of her presence, yet I noticed how his left shoulder tensed beneath his coat, how his breathing had grown shallow and measured, as though he were fighting against some invisible pressure. The wedding march continued its stately rhythm, played by the chapel's ancient organ, whose pipes sang with voices both celestial and mournful. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, creating harmonies that spoke of love and loss in equal measure. My world had shifted on its axis, tilting like a ship in a storm, and I found myself gripping Papa's arm more tightly to keep from swaying. No one else appeared to see her, this ethereal woman who watched me with a mixture of warning and pity. The guests continued their polite observation of the ceremony, Lady Pemberton dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, Lord Ashford nodding approvingly at what he no doubt considered an excellent merger of fortunes. My heart hammered against my stays as I forced myself to continue walking, each step bringing me closer to a union that suddenly felt less like a beginning and more like an ending. The woman's lips moved, though I heard no sound, and I found myself desperately trying to read the words she seemed so urgent to convey. Her mouth formed shapes that might have been no, or go, or perhaps my own name, each silent syllable carrying the weight of desperate warning. Her free hand gestured toward the chapel doors behind me, as though urging me to flee while I still could. Papa squeezed my arm gently, mistaking my hesitation for bridal nerves, and whispered reassurances about my good fortune in securing such an advantageous match. His voice was warm with paternal pride, the same tone he had used when I was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Steady on, my darling girl," he murmured. "This is everything we have dreamed of. The Duke is a good man, and you will be so very happy." The Ashworth fortune, built on railroads and steel, forged in the soot and smoke of industrial England, had finally purchased entry into the oldest circles of society. My marriage to the Duke would cement our family's place among the aristocracy, a dream Papa had harbored since my childhood in our modest country house, when he would read me stories of princesses and castles, and promise that one day I would live such a tale. Yet as I gazed upon the spectral figure beside my groom, I wondered what price such elevation truly demanded. Was happiness always the sacrifice required for advancement? Had other women stood where I now stood, weighing love against duty, desire against expectation? The woman in blue seemed to embody all those questions, her very presence a testament to dreams deferred or destroyed. Edward's eyes met mine across the remaining distance, and for a moment his composed expression flickered with something I could not name. His pupils were dilated despite the bright afternoon light, and there were lines of strain around his eyes that I had never noticed before. Was it guilt, fear, or merely the understandable nervousness of any man about to pledge his life to another? The woman in blue leaned closer to him, her ghostly fingers tightening on his sleeve, and I saw him shiver almost imperceptibly, a tremor that ran through his entire frame like a man walking over his own grave. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that on some level, perhaps he could sense her presence after all. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting, for it meant I was not losing my mind, that this vision was more than the product of wedding day hysteria. Something real and tangible was happening here, something that connected Edward to this ethereal woman in ways I could not yet comprehend. The chapel fell silent as we reached the altar, and Papa placed my hand in Edward's with the solemnity befitting such a moment. His palm was cold despite the warmth of the day, and when his fingers closed around mine, I felt as though I were grasping something already lost. His skin was damp with perspiration, and I could feel the rapid pulse at his wrist, far too fast for a man at ease. The spectral woman had moved to stand directly behind him now, her form so vivid to me that I could see the intricate beadwork on her bodice, each tiny pearl and crystal sewn with painstaking care, the way her diamond earrings caught light that seemed to come from nowhere. Reverend Morrison began the ancient words of the ceremony, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling with practiced authority. He was an elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands who had baptized half the noble families in the county and buried the other half. His words carried the weight of tradition, the same phrases spoken over countless couples who had stood where Edward and I now stood. Around us, the congregation settled into respectful attention, fans fluttering in the warm air, silk gowns rustling as ladies adjusted their positions for optimal viewing of what society would undoubtedly consider the wedding of the season. But I could focus on nothing save the impossible sight before me. The woman was speaking again, her lips forming words with increasing urgency, and this time I caught fragments of sound, as though her voice reached me from across a great distance or through the barrier between worlds. "Catherine," she seemed to whisper, and my name on her lips carried such weight of warning that my knees nearly buckled. "He must not. You cannot. The truth." Her voice faded in and out like a poorly tuned wireless, but the desperation in her tone was unmistakable. Edward's grip on my hand tightened, and when I looked up at his face, I saw that his usual composure had cracked entirely. His complexion had gone ashen beneath his natural olive tone, and a thin sheen of perspiration dotted his brow despite the chapel's coolness. His gaze darted nervously about the sanctuary, never quite settling on the spot where the woman stood, yet I sensed he knew exactly where she was. The realization struck me with crystalline clarity. This was not the first time he had encountered this particular ghost. As Reverend Morrison reached the portion of the ceremony where objections were invited, the woman in blue stepped forward with desperate purpose. Her form grew more solid, more present, and for one terrifying moment, I thought everyone in the chapel would suddenly see what I had been witnessing. Instead, she reached toward me with both hands, her mouth opening in what appeared to be a silent scream of warning. The temperature around us plummeted so suddenly that my breath misted in the air, and several of the altar candles flickered as though touched by an otherworldly breeze. The Reverend paused, looking about with confusion at the sudden disturbance, his rheumy eyes searching the rafters as though expecting to find an open window or damaged roof tile. But the chapel was sealed tight, and when no earthly explanation presented itself, he cleared his throat and continued with professional determination. Edward's hand in mine had begun to shake, and when I dared to meet his eyes, I saw something there that chilled me more thoroughly than any spectral presence. Recognition, and a guilt so profound it seemed to emanate from his very soul. He knew who she was, this woman who would not rest, and in that moment of understanding, I realized that my wedding day had become something far more dangerous than a simple ceremony. The woman began to fade as quickly as she had appeared, but not before pressing something into my free hand with fingers that felt like winter wind made manifest. When I looked down, I found a small, tarnished locket that had not been there moments before, its surface warm against my palm despite its ghostly origin. As her form dissolved completely, becoming nothing more than a whisper of blue shadow that vanished into the chapel's ancient stones, I heard her voice one final time, clear as church bells and twice as mournful. "Find the truth before it finds you, Catherine Ashworth. Your life may depend upon it." The ceremony concluded in a haze of congratulations and forced smiles, though the locket burned against my palm like a guilty secret. I managed to slip it into my reticule during the exchange of rings, my fingers trembling as they closed around its warm metal, while Edward's voice cracked slightly as he spoke his vows. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of crystal champagne flutes and elaborate speeches. The great dining hall of Ravenshollow Manor transformed into a glittering showcase of society's finest. Garlands of white roses and ivy draped every surface, their perfume mingling with the scent of roasted pheasant and honeyed cakes that graced the tables. Lady Pemberton gushed about my gown, while Lord Ashford regaled anyone who would listen with tales of my father's business acumen. Through it all, I smiled and nodded, played the part of the radiant bride, but my thoughts remained fixed on the ghostly woman who had stood beside my husband at the altar. Edward himself seemed to have recovered his composure, though I noticed how his jaw clenched whenever anyone mentioned our future happiness, and how his eyes never quite met mine during the toasts. When the dancing began in the ballroom, he led me through the first waltz with mechanical precision, his hand at my waist, feeling more like duty than desire. The chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across the polished floor, and the string quartet played with practiced elegance, yet I felt as though I were moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare dressed in silk and pearls. "You seem distracted, my dear," Edward murmured as we turned in time to the music. His breath was warm against my ear, but there was something strained in his tone, a tension that had not been there during our courtship. Wedding day nerves, I suppose, quite natural for a young lady. I forced myself to look up into his dark eyes, searching for some sign of the man who had wooed me so ardently in Mamma's garden. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace," I replied, using his formal title as had become our habit since the engagement was announced. Though I confess the ceremony felt rather overwhelming. The chapel has such a peculiar atmosphere, does it not? So full of history and shadows. Something flickered across his features, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Ravenshollow has been in my family for 3 centuries, he said carefully. "Every stone has witnessed countless joys and sorrows. Perhaps that is what you sense." His grip on my hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "But we must look to the future now, Catherine. The past is best left undisturbed." The words carried a warning that sent ice through my veins, though his tone remained perfectly cordial. As the waltz ended and he bowed over my hand, I caught sight of movement in the shadows near the ballroom's entrance. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw her again, the woman in blue, watching us with those infinitely sad eyes. But when I blinked and looked again, there was only empty space and the gentle sway of curtains in the evening breeze. The remainder of the evening stretched endlessly before me, filled with well-meaning guests who spoke of our bright future, while I felt increasingly trapped within the elaborate cage of my own making. When Edward announced that we would be retiring to the family's London residence the following morning, rather than embarking immediately on our wedding tour, I felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. London meant distance from this haunted place, but it also meant privacy, and I was no longer certain what secrets my new husband might be hiding in the shadows of our shared life. As the last guest departed and the servants began clearing away the remnants of celebration, I found myself alone in what had been designated as my private sitting room. The space was beautifully appointed with pale blue silk wallpaper and delicate Chippendale furniture, yet it felt as foreign as a museum display. Through the tall windows, I could see the manor's gardens stretching into darkness, their carefully manicured paths disappearing into patches of deeper shadow beneath ancient oak trees. With shaking hands, I retrieved the locket from my reticule and examined it properly for the first time. It was exquisitely crafted, though clearly old, its gold surface tarnished with age and bearing the intricate engravings typical of pieces from an earlier era. The clasp opened with surprising ease, revealing a miniature portrait painted on ivory. The face that gazed back at me was unmistakably that of the woman from the chapel, though in the painting she appeared younger, her auburn hair crowned with orange blossoms, her blue eyes bright with hope rather than sorrow. Beneath the portrait, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "Isabelle Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenshollow, 1847. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Edward's first wife, the woman whose tragic death had been whispered about in drawing rooms throughout London, though never in my presence. The official story, as I understood it from carefully overheard conversations, was that she had suffered some form of accident while riding alone on the estate. A fall from her horse, they said, her body discovered in a stream that bordered the property. She had been dead for nearly 15 years, and Edward had remained a widower until our meeting last spring. Yet here was evidence that Isabelle Blackwood had not found the peace that death was supposed to provide. More disturbing still was the warmth of the locket in my hands, as though it had been worn close to living skin only moments before. I pressed it to my chest and closed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. Was I truly seeing the spirit of Edward's first wife? Or had the stress of the wedding day caused my imagination to conjure phantoms from guilt and uncertainty? A soft knock at my door interrupted these unsettling thoughts. "Come in," I called, hastily closing the locket and slipping it into the drawer of my writing desk. My new lady's maid, Mrs. Hartwell, entered with practiced discretion, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a starched cap, her manner both efficient and kindly. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," she said, employing my new title with obvious pride. "His Grace has retired to his chambers and asked me to assist you with your preparations for the evening. Shall I help you from your gown?" The reality of my wedding night struck me with fresh force. In all the confusion and supernatural terror of the day, I had nearly forgotten that Edward would be expecting me to fulfill my wifely duties. The thought of sharing intimate space with a man who clearly harbored dangerous secrets filled me with a dread that had nothing to do with maidenly modesty. Yet what choice did I have? We were married now, bound by law and custom, and any attempt to avoid my obligations would only raise questions I was not prepared to answer. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," I managed, standing on unsteady legs. I confess myself rather fatigued by the day's events. As she began the complex process of unlacing my bodice and removing the dozen hairpins that secured my elaborate coiffure, I found myself wondering about the woman whose position I had now assumed. Had Isabelle stood in this very room on her wedding night, perhaps experiencing similar nerves and uncertainties? Had she worn a nightgown of silk and lace, scented with lavender water, as she prepared to meet her new husband in the marriage bed? "Mrs. Hartwell," I said carefully as she brushed out my long dark hair, "you have been in service at Ravenshollow for some time, Have you not? Indeed, your grace. Nearly 20 years come Michaelmas. I began as an upper housemaid under the previous duchess. Her hands stilled for a moment in my hair. A lovely lady she was, if I may say so, gentle and kind to all the staff. I have heard very little about her, I said, watching the maid's reflection in my dressing-table mirror. It must have been a terrible tragedy when she died so young. Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew carefully neutral, the practiced blankness of a servant who had learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Terrible indeed, your grace. Such a shock to everyone in the household. The Duchess was an accomplished horsewoman, you see. None of us could understand how such an accident might have occurred. An accident, I repeated, filing away the slight emphasis she had placed on the word. Yes, of course, though I suppose even the most skilled riders can encounter unexpected dangers. Certainly, your grace. Mrs. Hartwell resumed brushing my hair, but I sensed a tension in her movements that had not been there before. Will there be anything else you require this evening? I dismissed her with thanks, then sat alone before my mirror, studying my reflection in the flickering candlelight. My face looked pale and drawn, my eyes too bright, as though touched by fever or fear. The white silk nightgown Mrs. Hartwell had helped me into felt like a shroud, its delicate lace trim suddenly oppressive against my skin. Through the walls, I could hear the great house settling into nighttime quiet, the distant sound of servants securing doors and banking fires, the whisper of wind through the ancient eaves. A soft scratching at the connecting door to Edward's chambers made me start violently. Catherine! His voice was muffled by the heavy oak, but I could hear the careful control in it, as though he too were struggling with the weight of unspoken truths. May I come in? Of course, I replied, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. The door opened to reveal Edward in his dressing gown, his dark hair disheveled, his face bearing an expression I could not quite decipher. In the intimate lamplight, he looked younger somehow, less like the formidable Duke and more like a man wrestling with his own demons. He approached slowly, as though I might flee if startled, and took my hands in his. They were cold again, as they had been during the ceremony, and I noticed the fine tremor that ran through his fingers. Catherine, he said quietly, his eyes searching my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. I know today has been overwhelming for you. The ceremony, meeting so many new people, adjusting to life at Ravenshollow. It is a great deal for anyone to bear. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I spoke. His proximity was both comforting and terrifying, the familiar scent of his cologne now carrying undertones of something darker, something that spoke of secrets buried but not forgotten. I want you to know, he continued, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of my hands, that I will be patient with you. There is no need for haste in any aspect of our marriage. We have time to grow comfortable with one another, to build the trust that will sustain us through the years ahead. The kindness in his words was unexpected, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Here was the man I had fallen in love with during our courtship, the one who had recited poetry in Mama's rose garden and made me believe in fairy tale endings. Yet even as gratitude flooded through me, I could not forget the guilt I had seen in his eyes at the altar, or the way he had known exactly where Isabel's spirit stood. Edward, I whispered, gathering courage from some deep well of determination. Is there anything about your past, about Ravenshollow, that I should know? Anything that might help me understand my place here? For a long moment, he was silent, his hands tightening on mine as though anchoring himself to something solid in a world suddenly turned uncertain. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully chosen words. The past is a country we can visit, but never truly leave behind, Catherine. Ravenshollow has seen much joy and much sorrow over the centuries. Perhaps in time, when you have settled into your new life, I will share some of its stories with you. But not tonight. Tonight, let us focus on our future together. He leaned forward and kissed my forehead gently, a chaste blessing that somehow felt more intimate than passion. Sleep well, my dear wife. Tomorrow, we begin our new life in earnest. With that, he withdrew to his own chambers, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the terrible certainty that my husband's secrets were far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The following morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over my new life like a shroud. I woke before dawn, my sleep having been plagued by dreams of blue gowns and sorrowful eyes, and found myself unable to return to slumber, despite the exhaustion that weighted my limbs like lead. From my window, I could see the grounds of Ravenshollow stretching toward the horizon, their manicured perfection marred by patches of morning mist that clung to the low places like reluctant spirits. The gardens were beautiful in the pale light, with carefully tended rose beds and ornamental hedges that spoke of generations of careful cultivation. Yet something about the landscape filled me with unease. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to linger in certain corners, or how the ornamental lake reflected the sky with an oily darkness that suggested depths better left unexplored. Edward had already departed for his morning ride when I made my way downstairs to the breakfast room, a habit Mrs. Hartwell informed me he had maintained religiously for years. The thought of him traversing the same paths where his first wife had met her mysterious end sent an involuntary shiver through me, though I tried to push such morbid thoughts aside. Surely, if there had been any real danger, he would not continue to ride alone across the estate. The breakfast room itself was a study in understated elegance, its tall windows offering expansive views of the parkland while allowing the morning sun to stream across the polished mahogany table. Silver serving dishes gleamed beneath their warming lids, and the scent of fresh bread and coffee created an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that should have been comforting. Yet I found myself unable to enjoy even a single bite of the carefully prepared meal, my appetite having fled entirely in the face of mounting anxiety about my circumstances. "Good morning, Your Grace." The voice belonged to Pemberton, the butler, whose dignified bearing and silver hair marked him as a man who had served the Blackwood family for decades. "His Grace left word that you are to consider yourself entirely at liberty today. He has business in the village, but expects to return by tea-time." "Thank you, Pemberton," I replied, grateful for the reprieve from Edward's presence, though I immediately felt guilty for such uncharitable thoughts about my new husband. "Perhaps you could arrange for someone to show me more of the house? I should like to familiarize myself with my new home." "Certainly, Your Grace. Mrs. Morrison, the housekeeper, would be delighted to conduct a proper tour. Shall I have her attend you at your convenience?" Within the hour, I found myself in the company of a pleasant woman whose starched apron and capable manner inspired immediate confidence. Mrs. Morrison had served as housekeeper for the past 12 years, having assumed the position after the previous duchess's death, and her knowledge of the house's history proved both fascinating and troubling. "Ravenshollow was built in 1634, she explained, as we moved through a gallery lined with family portraits spanning 3 centuries. Each generation has added their own touches, of course, but the bones of the place remain unchanged. The current Duke's great-grandfather was quite the collector, as you can see." She gestured toward an impressive array of paintings and sculptures that would not have looked out of place in the British Museum. As we walked, I found my eyes drawn repeatedly to a particular portrait that seemed to watch our progress with unusual intensity. The woman depicted wore a gown of deep blue silk, her auburn hair crowned with a delicate tiara, her eyes holding a mixture of intelligence and melancholy that was hauntingly familiar. "That is the previous duchess, I assume?" Mrs. Morrison's expression grew carefully neutral, much as Mrs. Hartwell's had the previous evening. "Yes, Your Grace, the late Duchess Isabelle, a beautiful lady and much beloved by all who knew her." She paused, as though weighing her words carefully. "She took a great interest in the welfare of the estate workers and their families. Her charity work in the village was quite extensive. She appears to have been very young when she died," I observed, studying the painted features that had haunted my wedding day. "What a tragedy it must have been for everyone." "Indeed, Your Grace, the Duchess was only 28 when the accident occurred. Such a shock it was, particularly as she had seemed in excellent health and spirits only the day before." Mrs. Morrison's voice carried a note of something I could not quite identify, a tension that suggested unspoken reservations about the official account of events. "The day before," I repeated, sensing an opportunity to learn more. "Was there anything unusual about her behavior that day? Anything that might have suggested she was troubled or distracted?" The housekeeper glanced around nervously, as though checking for eavesdroppers, before lowering her voice. "Well, Your Grace, It may not be my place to say, but the Duchess had been spending considerable time in the library during her final weeks. Research, she called it, though she never explained what she was investigating. She had also taken to walking alone at odd hours, sometimes well after midnight. The night staff reported seeing her in various parts of the house, always carrying a lamp, always seeming to search for something. A chill ran down my spine at this revelation. The image of Isabelle wandering the darkened corridors of Ravenshollow, lamp in hand, searching for answers to some unknown question, struck me as deeply ominous. Did she ever mention what she was looking for? No, Your Grace. But I do recall that she asked many questions about the house's history, particularly regarding the earlier duchesses. She spent hours examining old family records and correspondence, some dating back generations. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that the Duchess had become quite interested in a predecessor who had died under unusual circumstances in the previous century. The implications of this information settled over me like a lead blanket. Had Isabelle discovered something about the Blackwood family history that had ultimately cost her life? Was there a pattern of mysterious deaths among the women who had married into this ancient lineage? My hand unconsciously moved to my throat, as though I could already feel invisible fingers tightening around my neck. Mrs. Morrison, I said carefully, would it be possible for me to see the library where the Duchess conducted her research? I have always been fond of reading, and I should very much like to examine the family records she found so fascinating. The housekeeper's expression grew troubled, and she glanced nervously toward the painted eyes of Isabelle's portrait. Certainly, Your Grace, though I should mention that His Grace has requested the library remain undisturbed since the Duchess's passing. Perhaps you might wish to speak with him before exploring those particular materials. The warning was clear, though couched in the respectful language appropriate to her station. Edward did not want the library disturbed, which only strengthened my determination to examine whatever secrets it might contain. Of course, I replied smoothly. I shall certainly discuss it with my husband. In the meantime, perhaps you could show me the rest of the public rooms? The tour continued through drawing rooms and parlors, each space beautifully appointed yet somehow sterile, as though the house itself were holding its breath. When we reached the music room, with its grand piano and walls lined with sheet music, Mrs. Morrison's demeanor brightened considerably. The Duchess was quite accomplished at the piano, she said, her voice warming with genuine affection. She would often play in the evenings, particularly when His Grace was away on business. Such beautiful music she made, though toward the end her selections became rather melancholy. Chopin nocturnes mostly, and the occasional funeral march. The staff used to say the house itself seemed to weep when she played. I approached the piano bench and lifted the lid to reveal keys that gleamed like pearls in the afternoon light. Several pieces of sheet music lay scattered across the stand, their pages yellowed with age and bearing notations in a delicate feminine hand. As I examined them more closely, I noticed that many passages had been marked with particular emphasis, as though the player had been trying to convey some specific emotion or message through her musical choices. Mrs. Morrison, I said suddenly, an idea forming in my mind. Do you know if there were any witnesses to the Duchess's riding accident? Anyone who might have seen what happened? The housekeeper's face went pale, and she wrung her hands nervously in her apron. Well, Your Grace, that is rather a delicate matter. There was young Thomas Fletcher, one of the stable boys at the time. He claimed to have seen something unusual that morning, but His Grace felt the boy was overwrought by grief and not to be trusted in his recollections. What did he claim to have seen? Mrs. Morrison looked around once more, as though expecting Edward himself to materialize from the shadows. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas said he saw the Duchess riding toward Willow Creek, just as the mist was lifting. But he also claimed to see another rider following her at a distance, staying to the shadows of the trees. When he mentioned this to His Grace, he was told that grief had affected his vision and that he must never repeat such tales to anyone. My heart began to race as the implications of this revelation sank in. If Thomas Fletcher's account were true, then Isabelle's death had been no accident at all. Someone had deliberately followed her to that isolated spot by the creek. Someone who had wanted her silenced permanently. The question that burned in my mind was whether Edward had been involved in covering up the truth, or whether he too had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control. "Where is Thomas Fletcher now?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Gone from the estate within a week of the Duchess's funeral, Your Grace. His Grace provided him with an excellent reference and a generous settlement, saying the boy needed a fresh start away from the painful memories. He found employment with a family in Yorkshire, or so I was told." "Or so you were told," I thought grimly. More likely, Thomas Fletcher had been paid to disappear, his inconvenient testimony buried along with whatever truth he had witnessed that morning. The web of deception surrounding Isabelle's death was becoming more complex with each revelation, and I found myself wondering how many other witnesses had been similarly silenced or discredited. As Mrs. Morrison concluded our tour, I made polite conversation about household arrangements and daily routines, but my mind was racing with plans. I needed to examine the library and its collection of family records, regardless of Edward's wishes on the matter. I needed to learn more about the pattern of deaths among previous duchesses that had so fascinated Isabelle during her final weeks. Most importantly, I needed to discover what secret had been worth killing for, because I was becoming increasingly certain that my predecessor had been murdered. That evening, as I dressed for dinner in a gown of deep green silk that Mrs. Hartwell assured me was perfectly appropriate for a quiet meal at home, I studied my reflection and wondered if I was being foolish to pursue such dangerous knowledge. Perhaps ignorance truly was bliss, and I would be wiser to accept my comfortable new life without questioning its foundations. Yet even as these doubts plagued me, I could not forget the desperate urgency in Isabelle's ghostly warning, or the weight of the locket that now rested against my heart beneath my bodice. Edward returned from his business in the village in time for dinner, his manner cordial but distant as we shared a meal of roasted lamb and seasonal vegetables in the formal dining room. The conversation remained safely superficial, touching on plans for our eventual move to London, the upcoming social season, and various estate matters that required attention. Yet beneath his polished exterior, I sensed a tension that had not been present during our courtship, a watchfulness that made me feel as though I were being studied and evaluated with each word I spoke. "Catherine," he said as the servants cleared away the final course, "I hope Mrs. Morrison's tour of the house proved informative. Ravenshollow can be rather overwhelming for someone unaccustomed to managing such a large establishment." "Indeed, it is quite magnificent," I replied carefully. "The family portraits in the gallery are particularly impressive. Mrs. Morrison was kind enough to share some of their stories with me." Something flickered in Edward's dark eyes, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Yes, the gallery contains several centuries of Blackwood history. I trust you found the tour enlightening without being too overwhelming. Some aspects of family history can be rather melancholy for those of a sensitive disposition." The warning in his words was unmistakable, though delivered with perfect courtesy. "Of course," I said smoothly, though I must confess to being quite interested in the family library. Mrs. Morrison mentioned that it contains extensive historical records. As someone who has always enjoyed reading, I should very much like to explore what treasures it might contain. Edward's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for a moment the silence stretched between us like a taut wire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of finality that brooked no argument. "The library has been closed since my first wife's death, Catherine. Many of the older documents are quite fragile and require careful handling. Perhaps when we are settled in London, we can arrange for a proper historian to catalogue the collection. Until then, I must ask that you respect my wishes and leave that particular room undisturbed." The firmness of his refusal only strengthened my determination to discover what secrets those books and papers might contain. "Of course, my dear," I said aloud, while silently vowing that I would find a way into that library before another day passed. Whatever truth had cost Isabelle Blackwood her life was waiting for me in those forbidden volumes, and I would not rest until I had uncovered every deadly secret that Ravenshollow Manor contained. The opportunity I had been waiting for presented itself 3 nights later, when Edward announced over breakfast that urgent business would require him to travel to London immediately. A problem with investments, he explained, his manner suggesting the matter was both pressing and confidential. He would depart within the hour and expected to be away for at least 2 days, possibly longer depending on the complexity of the situation. "I regret leaving you so soon after our wedding," he said, his hand covering mine across the breakfast table with what appeared to be genuine affection. "But these matters cannot wait, and I prefer to handle them personally rather than trust such delicate negotiations to intermediaries." "Of course, my dear," I replied, hoping my voice conveyed appropriate disappointment rather than the surge of excitement I actually felt. "I shall occupy myself with settling into my new role. Perhaps this will give me time to become better acquainted with the household staff and estate routines." Edward's eyes studied my face with that unsettling intensity I had come to recognize, as though he were searching for hidden meanings in my words. "Yes, quite sensible. Though I must ask that you not overtax yourself. Ravenshollow can be quite demanding for those unused to its particular requirements. Rest and gentle activities would be most appropriate for a new bride still adjusting to married life." The patronizing tone rankled, though I managed to maintain my serene expression. "Naturally, I shall be the picture of proper conduct in your absence." Something in my phrasing must have struck him oddly, for he leaned forward slightly, his grip on my hand tightening. "Catherine, I want you to promise me something. While I am away, please confine your explorations to the public areas of the house. Some of the older wings can be quite dangerous, particularly for someone unfamiliar with their layout. Loose floorboards, unstable banisters, that sort of thing. I could not bear for any harm to come to you through such carelessness on my part." "I promise to exercise appropriate caution," I said, which was not quite the same as agreeing to his restrictions, though I hoped he would not notice the distinction. He seemed satisfied with this response, though I caught him studying me once more as he gathered his correspondence and prepared for departure. The kiss he pressed to my forehead felt more like a blessing than an expression of marital affection, and I found myself wondering if he suspected my true intentions despite my careful performance of wifely obedience. I watched from the morning room window as his carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, then waited another full hour to ensure he had not turned back for some forgotten item. Only then did I make my way through the house toward the library, my heart hammering with a mixture of anticipation and terror at what I might discover. The library occupied the entire east wing of Ravenshollow's ground floor, its double doors crafted from oak so ancient it appeared almost black in the dim hallway light. A heavy brass key protruded from the lock, suggesting that Edward's prohibition was more about respect for his wishes than any physical barrier to entry. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the key and pushed open the doors, half expecting Isabelle's spirit to materialize before me with warnings about the dangers that lay beyond. Instead, I found myself in a chamber that took my breath away with its magnificent beauty. The room stretched at least 60 feet in length, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Tall windows along the eastern wall allowed morning sunlight to stream across reading tables positioned for optimal illumination, while a massive fireplace dominated the western wall, its carved mantelpiece bearing the Blackwood coat of arms in exquisite detail. Yet despite its grandeur, the library bore an unmistakable air of abandonment. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, and cobwebs had begun to form in the upper corners where the housemaids clearly had not been permitted to venture. Several books lay scattered across one of the reading tables as though their reader had been interrupted mid-study, and I realized these must be the volumes Isabelle had been examining during her final weeks of life. I approached the table with reverent care, my footsteps muffled by a Persian carpet that had once been magnificent but now showed signs of neglect. The books were a mixture of family histories, genealogical records, and what appeared to be personal correspondence, dating back several generations. Many pages bore markers in Isabelle's delicate script, brief notations that suggested she had been tracing particular bloodlines or searching for connections between seemingly unrelated events. The first volume I examined was a comprehensive history of the Blackwood family, beginning with the first Duke who had acquired Ravenshollow through service to King Charles VI. The early chapters chronicled the typical rise of a noble house through military service, advantageous marriages, and careful accumulation of land and wealth. Nothing seemed particularly sinister, until I reached the sections dealing with the late 17th and early 18th centuries, where Isabelle had made numerous marginal notes. The pattern that had captured her attention became clear as I read more carefully. Beginning with the third Duchess, who had died mysteriously in 1689, there appeared to be a troubling frequency of early deaths among the women who married into the family. The official causes varied: riding accidents, sudden illness, tragic falls, but the timing was consistently suspicious. Each death had occurred within 5 years of marriage, often just as the Duchess in question might have been expected to produce a male heir to continue the line. My hands began to shake as I realized the implications of what I was reading. The fourth Duchess had supposedly died of a fever after only 2 years of marriage, though the family physician had noted in his private correspondence that her symptoms were inconsistent with any known disease. The fifth Duchess had drowned in the ornamental lake during what was described as an evening walk, despite being known as an excellent swimmer who had grown up near the coast. The pattern continued through the generations, each death carefully documented yet somehow unconvincing when examined closely. Isabelle had been methodical in her research, tracing not only the deaths themselves, but also the circumstances surrounding each incident. In several cases, she had discovered discrepancies between official accounts and private letters or diary entries. Witnesses who had initially reported strange circumstances often changed their stories after speaking with the Duke of the time, usually accompanied by sudden improvements in their financial situations or unexpected opportunities for advancement. The most damning evidence lay in a collection of letters I found tied with black ribbon, correspondence between various dukes and their trusted advisors regarding the problem of female interference. The language was carefully coded, but the meaning was unmistakable. The Blackwood men had developed a systematic approach to eliminating wives who proved too curious about family secrets or too independent in their thinking. One letter in particular, written by Edward's grandfather to his steward, made my blood run cold. The new Duchess has been asking unfortunate questions about her predecessor's death. I fear we must consider implementing the same solution that served us so well in the past. A riding accident would be most appropriate, given her known fondness for morning excursions. Please see to the necessary arrangements and ensure that any witnesses understand the importance of maintaining the correct version of events. The letter was dated only 3 weeks before that Duchess's fatal riding accident. Exactly the type of coincidence that had claimed so many Blackwood wives over the centuries. I sank into one of the reading chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight, as the full scope of what I had uncovered became clear. The Blackwood family had been murdering their wives for generations, eliminating any woman who threatened to expose whatever dark secret lay at the heart of their power and wealth. But what could be so terrible that it justified centuries of murder? I forced myself to continue reading, searching through Isabelle's notes for some clue about the original sin that had necessitated such extreme measures. The answer lay in a slim volume, bound in black leather, hidden beneath the other books, as though Isabelle had tried to conceal it, even from herself. The book contained the private journal of the first Duchess, written during the early years of the Restoration. Her account painted a picture of her husband that bore no resemblance to the noble patriot celebrated in official family histories. According to her careful documentation, the first Duke had been a Catholic loyalist who had secretly betrayed parliamentary forces to the Royalists, leading to the massacre of an entire regiment of Commonwealth soldiers who had trusted him with information about their positions. The wealth that had built Ravenshollow, the land grants that had established the dukedom, all of it had been purchased with the blood of men who had died because of one man's treachery. Worse still, the evidence suggested that each successive duke had added to the family's crimes, using their position and influence to eliminate anyone who discovered the truth about their origins. The murdered wives were only the most recent victims in a chain of violence that stretched back nearly 2 centuries. As I sat surrounded by the evidence of systematic evil, I understood why Isabelle had been walking the halls at midnight, carrying her lamp through the darkness. She had been trying to find a way to expose the truth without destroying herself in the process, searching for some means of bringing justice to the victims whose deaths had been forgotten by history. Her own death proved she had failed to find a safe path forward, but her meticulous research had preserved the evidence for someone else to discover. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside sent ice through my veins. I had been so absorbed in reading that I had lost track of time, and the light outside the windows had shifted from morning brightness to the golden tones of late afternoon. Edward was not expected back until the following day at the earliest, but perhaps he had concluded his business earlier than anticipated. If he found me here, surrounded by the evidence of his family's crimes, I had no doubt that my own convenient accident would follow shortly. Moving with desperate haste, I gathered the most damning documents and concealed them beneath my bodice, the papers crackling softly against my stays. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, but I dared not leave such vital evidence where Edward might discover it missing. The rest of Isabelle's research I arranged as closely as possible to how I had found it, hoping that a casual inspection would not reveal any disturbance. The footsteps had grown closer, accompanied by voices I did not recognize. As I made my way toward the library doors, I caught fragments of conversation that made my situation even more perilous. Two men were discussing arrangements for my surveillance, their words confirming that Edward had left explicit instructions for my activities to be monitored in his absence. His Grace was quite specific about the Duchess not being allowed into the library or the sealed wing, one voice was saying. Said she was of a curious disposition and might get herself into trouble if left entirely unwatched. Understood, replied the second man. I'll have the footman report any unusual behavior. Better safe than sorry, particularly given what happened to the last Duchess. The casual way they discussed Isabelle's murder made my stomach turn, but it also confirmed that the household staff were complicit in the family's crimes. I could trust no one at Ravenshollow except perhaps Mrs. Hartwell, whose loyalty seemed to lie with me personally rather than with the Blackwood name. Even that was uncertain, given the web of fear and corruption that apparently infected every aspect of life on the estate. I managed to slip out of the library through a side door that led to the conservatory, avoiding the men in the corridor through what felt like divine providence. The afternoon sun felt like a blessing on my face after the oppressive atmosphere of that chamber of secrets, though I knew my relief was temporary at best. I had gained invaluable knowledge about the danger I faced, but I was still trapped at Ravenshollow with no clear means of escape or any way to expose the truth without sealing my own fate. That evening, as I dressed for dinner in solitary state, I examined the documents I had stolen with more careful attention. Hidden among the genealogical records was a map showing the locations where various accidents had occurred over the years, each site marked with a small cross and dated notation. The pattern suggested careful planning, with favorite locations being used repeatedly once they had proven effective for staging believable mishaps. Willow Creek, where Isabelle had died, bore 3 crosses spanning different decades. The ornamental lake had claimed 2 victims, while the treacherous stretch of moor to the south of the house had accounted for several more. Most disturbing of all was a location marked simply as the Tower Room, which appeared to have been used for duchesses whose deaths required more privacy than outdoor accidents could provide. As I sat alone in the vast dining room, picking at a meal I could barely taste, I realized that my situation had become desperate. Edward would return within a day or two, and once he discovered that I had penetrated his carefully guarded secrets, my life would be measured in hours rather than years. I needed to find a way to escape Ravenshollow immediately, but I also knew that simply fleeing would accomplish nothing. Without the evidence to expose the Blackwood crimes, I would spend the rest of my life as a fugitive, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering when they would find me. The solution, when it came to me, was so audacious that I almost dismissed it as impossible. Yet, as I considered the alternatives, I realized it might be my only hope of survival. I would not run from Ravenshollow like a frightened child. Instead, I would do what Isabelle had been unable to accomplish. I would find a way to expose the truth and bring justice to the victims of centuries of Blackwood violence, even if it cost me my life in the attempt. But first, I needed to contact the one person who might be able to help me, someone whose professional expertise in matters of crime and justice could provide the support I desperately needed. I had noticed during our wedding reception a young inspector from Scotland Yard who had been among the guests, a connection of Papa's through his business dealings in London. Inspector James Whitmore had seemed both intelligent and honest, qualities that might prove invaluable in the battle I was about to undertake. As midnight approached and the house settled into its usual quiet, I made my way to the morning room, where I knew I could write letters without risk of observation. My note to Inspector Whitmore was necessarily cryptic, requesting his assistance with a matter of urgent importance that I could not discuss through correspondence, but which required his immediate attention. I included enough hints about potential criminal activity to ensure his professional interest while avoiding any details that might endanger him if the letter were intercepted. The greater challenge lay in finding a way to send the letter without the household staff becoming aware of my communication with the outside world. After much consideration, I decided to trust Mrs. Hartwell with the task, gambling that her personal loyalty to me outweighed any fear she might have of Edward's displeasure. When she came to attend me the following morning, I pressed the sealed letter into her hands, along with a sovereign for postage and discretion. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said quietly, "I need this letter delivered to London with the utmost urgency and secrecy. It concerns a matter that could mean life or death, though I cannot explain more without putting you at risk. Will you help me?" The maid's eyes searched my face with the shrewd intelligence I had always sensed beneath her deferential manner. After a long moment, she nodded slowly and concealed the letter in her apron. "I have a nephew who drives the mail coach, Your Grace. He can see that your message reaches its destination without questions being asked." "Thank you," I whispered, feeling tears of gratitude prick at my eyes. "You may be saving more lives than you know." Now I could only wait and pray that Inspector Whitmore would take my plea seriously enough to investigate, and that he would arrive at Ravenshollow before Edward discovered my deception. The game of life and death that had claimed so many duchesses before me was about to begin in earnest, and I was determined that this time the victim would not go quietly to her grave. Inspector Whitmore arrived at Ravenshollow on a rain-soaked afternoon exactly 36 hours after I had dispatched my desperate plea, his handsome cab appearing through the mist like an answer to my most fervent prayers. I watched from my sitting-room window as he stepped down onto the gravel drive, a tall figure in a dark greatcoat whose bearing suggested both professional competence and personal courage. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that my gamble had paid off, that help had arrived just as my situation was becoming truly desperate. Edward had returned from London that very morning, his mood darker than I had ever witnessed, his eyes holding a cold calculation that made my blood run to ice. During our stilted breakfast conversation, he had mentioned several times how much he looked forward to our quiet evening together, speaking with the sort of emphasis that transformed ordinary words into threats. I had no doubt that he intended to resolve the problem of my curiosity permanently before another day passed. "Your Grace," Pemberton announced from my sitting-room doorway, his expression carefully neutral, "there is an Inspector Whitmore from Scotland Yard requesting an audience. He claims to have business regarding some irregularities in estate documentation that require immediate attention." I managed to keep my voice steady despite the relief flooding through me. "How curious. I suppose you had better show him to the drawing room, Pemberton. I shall attend him directly." "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I inform His Grace of the inspector's arrival?" "Not just yet," I said, hoping my tone conveyed appropriate ducal authority. "I should like to understand the nature of these irregularities before troubling my husband with such tedious matters. He has been quite fatigued by his recent business in London." Inspector Whitmore proved to be a man of perhaps 35 years, with intelligent gray eyes and the sort of steady demeanor that inspired immediate confidence. When I entered the drawing room, he rose and bowed with perfect courtesy, though I caught the sharp assessment in his gaze as he studied my appearance. No doubt my pallor and the dark circles beneath my eyes told their own story about my current circumstances. "Your Grace," he said formally, "I apologize for arriving without proper notice, but your letter suggested a matter of considerable urgency. I confess myself intrigued by your reference to potential criminal activity requiring immediate investigation." I glanced toward the door, acutely conscious that our conversation might be overheard by household staff whose loyalties remained dangerously uncertain. "Indeed, Inspector. Perhaps you would care to take a turn about the gardens while we discuss these delicate matters. The afternoon air might prove beneficial after your journey." He understood immediately, nodding his agreement as I led him through the French doors onto the terrace that overlooked Ravenshallow's carefully manicured grounds. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds still hung low over the estate, creating an atmosphere of oppressive gloom that seemed entirely appropriate for the revelations I was about to share. Once we were safely distant from the house, walking along a graveled path that wound through rose gardens toward a secluded arbor, I began to speak in low, urgent tones. "Inspector Whitmore, what I am about to tell you will strain your credulity, but I assure you that every word is true. I have discovered evidence of systematic murder spanning several generations, crimes that have been carefully concealed behind a facade of accidental deaths and family tragedy." His eyebrows rose, but he did not interrupt as I continued. "The Blackwood family has been eliminating their wives whenever those women threaten to expose a secret that dates back to the Civil War period. I have found documentary evidence proving that at least a dozen duchesses have been murdered over the past 2 centuries, all to protect the truth about how this dukedom was truly established." "These are grave accusations, Your Grace," Inspector Whitmore said carefully. "I assume you have evidence to support such claims?" From within my bodice, I withdrew the documents I had concealed there since my expedition to the library, the papers rustling softly as I handed them to him. Letters, genealogical records, and most damning of all, correspondence between various dukes and their accomplices discussing the methodology for staging convincing accidents. The pattern is unmistakable once you know what to look for. The inspector examined the papers with the focused attention of a professional, his expression growing increasingly grim as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. "My God," he murmured after several minutes. "If these documents are authentic, they represent evidence of the most extensive criminal conspiracy in British history." "They are authentic," I assured him, "and I believe my own life is in immediate danger. My husband returned from London this morning in a mood that suggests he suspects my knowledge of these matters. I fear that before this day ends, I may join the ranks of convenient accidents that have claimed so many women before me." Inspector Whitmore straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the inner pocket where I assumed he carried his service revolver. "Then we must act immediately. I shall arrest the Duke of Ravenshollow on suspicion of murder and conspiracy, though I confess the jurisdictional complications will be considerable given his rank and influence." "Wait," I said, catching his arm as he turned back toward the house. "There is something else you must understand. This conspiracy involves more than just my husband. The household staff, the local magistrates, possibly even officials in London who have helped suppress investigations over the years. If you arrest Edward without proper preparation, the evidence may disappear and witnesses may suddenly develop convenient lapses of memory." The inspector nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in my caution. "What do you propose?" "A trap," I said, the words coming to me with crystalline clarity born of desperate necessity. "Allow Edward to believe his secret remains safe, that I suspect nothing of his true nature. Meanwhile, you can use these documents to gather additional evidence and prepare warrants that cannot be easily circumvented. When we spring our trap, it must be comprehensive enough to sweep up the entire network of accomplices." "And what of your safety during this interval? If the Duke truly intends you harm, we may be gambling with your life." I smiled grimly, touching the small pistol I had concealed in my reticule, a precaution I had taken that very morning when the extent of my peril became clear. "I am not entirely defenseless, Inspector, and I have one advantage that previous duchesses lacked. I know what I am facing. Forewarned is forearmed, as they say." We spent the next hour devising a plan that balanced the need for thorough evidence gathering against the urgent requirement for my protection. Inspector Whitmore would return to London immediately, ostensibly having found nothing of interest during his brief visit. Meanwhile, he would use the documents I had provided to secure proper warrants and gather additional investigators whose loyalty to justice outweighed any deference to noble rank. "I shall return within 3 days," he promised as we made our way back toward the house. "Can you maintain your masquerade of ignorance for that length of time?" "I have little choice," I replied, though privately I wondered if my nerve would hold under the strain of pretending normalcy while sleeping under the same roof as a man who was planning my murder. That evening, as Edward and I dined together in the formal dining room, I summoned every ounce of acting ability I possessed to play the role of the dutiful wife who suspected nothing more sinister than her husband's preoccupation with business matters. The conversation ranged over safe topics, plans for the London season, arrangements for entertaining various political figures who sought Edward's support for their causes. Yet beneath the civilized surface, I sensed him studying my every word and gesture, searching for some sign that my loyalty might be wavering. "You seem rather subdued tonight, my dear," he observed as the servants cleared away the final course. "I hope my absence did not leave you too much to your own devices. Solitude can sometimes encourage unfortunate brooding in ladies of a sensitive disposition." "Not at all," I replied smoothly. "I found plenty to occupy my time becoming better acquainted with the household routines. Mrs. Morrison was most helpful in explaining the various traditions and expectations associated with my new position." Something flickered in his dark eyes, an alertness that suggested my words had triggered some internal calculation. "Indeed? I trust she confined her explanations to practical matters rather than dwelling on historical curiosities that might prove unsettling." "Oh, quite," I assured him, maintaining an expression of innocent confusion, though I must admit to being somewhat puzzled by one small matter. There was mention of a previous duchess who died in a riding accident, and I wondered if perhaps I should avoid certain areas of the estate when I eventually take up riding myself. The silence that followed my question stretched like a taut wire, filled with tension so thick I could almost taste it on my tongue. Edward's fork remained suspended halfway to his mouth, his entire body gone rigid with what might have been surprise or calculation, or possibly both. "Ah, yes," he said finally, his voice carefully modulated to suggest casual regret rather than guilty knowledge. "Poor Isabelle. Such a tragedy, particularly as she was an accomplished horsewoman. But accidents can happen to anyone, regardless of skill or experience. The important thing is to exercise appropriate caution and never ride alone in unfamiliar territory." "Of course," I agreed readily. "Though it must have been terribly difficult for you, losing your wife so young and under such shocking circumstances. No wonder you remained a widower for so many years." Again that calculating silence, as though he were weighing my words for hidden meanings or testing my performance for cracks in its facade. "The grief was considerable," he admitted. "Though time does heal such wounds, particularly when one is blessed with the opportunity to begin anew with someone as lovely and understanding as yourself." The compliment carried undertones that made my skin crawl, delivered as it was by a man who was almost certainly planning my death, even as he spoke. I managed to smile graciously while mentally rehearsing the location of the pistol in my reticule and calculating the distance to the nearest exit. As we retired to our respective chambers that night, Edward's kiss upon my forehead felt like a benediction delivered by the angel of death himself. I waited in my sitting room until the sounds of the household had settled into the deep quiet of midnight, then made my way carefully through the darkened corridors toward the library. If I was to survive the next few days, I needed additional evidence to support my case, documentation that would be impossible for Edward to dismiss or explain away. The library felt different in the darkness, its familiar shadows transformed into lurking threats that seemed to watch my progress with malevolent interest. By the light of a carefully shaded lamp, I continued my examination of Isabelle's research, searching for details that might have escaped my attention during my previous hasty exploration. What I found chilled me to the bone. Hidden within a collection of estate records was a leather portfolio containing detailed sketches and notes that appeared to document the methodology used for staging various accidents over the years. The drawings were precise and clinical, showing exactly how to sabotage a saddle girth so that it would fail at a predetermined moment, or how to arrange loose stones on a cliff path to create a convincing rockfall. Most horrifying of all was a diagram showing the layout of the tower room, with notations indicating how the chamber could be prepared for what the notes euphemistically termed indoor solutions. Apparently, when outdoor accidents proved impractical, the Blackwood Dukes had a more private alternative available for dealing with inconvenient wives. As I studied these nightmarish documents, a soft sound from the corridor outside made me freeze in terror. Footsteps were approaching the library, slow and deliberate, suggesting someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find. I extinguished my lamp immediately and pressed myself against the wall behind one of the tall bookcases, praying that the darkness would provide adequate concealment. The library doors opened with a soft creak, and a figure entered carrying a lamp whose light cast wavering shadows across the walls. Even without seeing his face clearly, I knew it was Edward, drawn by some instinct or perhaps by reports from servants who had noticed my absence from my chambers. He moved through the library with the confidence of long familiarity, checking the reading table where Isabelle's research lay scattered, examining the windows for signs of disturbance. "Catherine," he called softly, his voice carrying across the silence like a snake's whisper. "I know you are here, my dear. There is no point in hiding from me now." I remained motionless, barely breathing, as he continued his methodical search of the room. The irony was not lost on me that I was hiding among the very books and papers that documented his family's centuries of crime, surrounded by the evidence that would ultimately bring him to justice, if I could survive long enough to see it presented in court. "You have been very clever, Catherine," Edward continued, his tone conversational despite the sinister circumstances. "More clever than I initially realized, which is my own fault for underestimating your intelligence. But cleverness without wisdom can be a dangerous combination, particularly for young women who fail to appreciate the complexities of their situation." He was moving closer to my hiding place, the lamplight growing stronger as he approached the section of bookcases where I crouched in terrified silence. I eased the pistol from my reticule as quietly as possible, my hands shaking so violently that I feared the weapon might slip from my grasp. "You see, my dear wife," he said, now close enough that I could hear the leather of his shoes creaking with each step. "There are certain family traditions that transcend personal preference or individual conscience. Duties that must be fulfilled regardless of how distasteful they might seem to those of a more delicate sensibility." The lamplight suddenly flooded my hiding place as Edward rounded the edge of the bookcase, his dark eyes reflecting the flame like those of some predatory animal caught in torchlight. For a moment, we stared at each other in absolute silence, predator and prey frozen in a tableau of mutual recognition. "Ah, there you are," he said pleasantly, as though we had encountered each other at a garden party rather than in the midst of a deadly game of cat and mouse. "I confess myself impressed by your dedication to research, though I fear your curiosity has led you into areas that would have been better left unexplored." "Stay back," I warned, raising the pistol with hands that I willed to steadiness. "I know what you are, Edward. I know about Isabelle, about all the others. The days of convenient accidents are over." His eyebrows rose in what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Armed as well as clever. You really are quite remarkable, Catherine. Under different circumstances, I might have genuinely enjoyed our marriage." He set his lamp down on a nearby table, the action deliberate and unthreatening. But sadly, circumstances are what they are, and certain obligations must take precedence over personal sentiment. "The only obligation that matters now is justice," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Inspector Whitmore has already seen the evidence. Even if you kill me tonight, the truth will still come to light." For the first time, Edward's composure showed cracks, his eyes narrowing as he processed this information. "Inspector Whitmore? I was not aware that you had been in communication with Scotland Yard." "There are many things you were not aware of," I said, taking courage from the uncertainty I heard in his voice. "Did you truly believe I would simply accept my fate, like all the others? That I would walk meekly to my destruction without fighting back?" "Most women do," he replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "Even Isabelle, for all her intelligence and determination, proved surprisingly easy to manage once the moment of truth arrived. A few drops of laudanum in her morning tea, and she was docile as a lamb when I led her down to Willow Creek." The casual admission of murder, delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, filled me with such rage that my finger tightened on the pistol's trigger. Only the knowledge that I needed him alive to face justice prevented me from firing immediately. "You drugged her," I said, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "That's how you managed to stage the accident so convincingly." "She was too incapacitated to resist or call for help." "Among other techniques developed over the years," Edward agreed. "The methodology has been refined through generations of practice, you understand. Each duke learns from his predecessor's experiences and makes improvements where necessary. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel interrupted our deadly conversation. The rattle and clatter of multiple vehicles approaching the house at speed. Edward's head snapped toward the windows, his expression shifting from confident control to alarm as he realized that his careful plans were about to be disrupted. "It seems Inspector Whitmore was more efficient than anticipated," I observed with grim satisfaction. "I suspect your reign of terror is about to come to an end." Edward's face twisted with fury as the full implications of his situation became clear. The evidence of his crimes surrounded us in the very room where we stood, and the arrival of Scotland Yard investigators meant that his opportunities for escape or concealment had vanished. For the first time in centuries, a Duke of Ravenshollow faced the prospect of answering for his family's crimes. "You have destroyed everything," he snarled, his mask of civilization finally slipping completely. "Centuries of careful work, generations of sacrifice and dedication to preserving what my ancestors built, all of it ruined by one meddlesome woman who could not accept her proper place." "Good," I replied simply, as the sounds of authoritative voices and heavy footsteps filled the house. It was time for the murdering to stop. Inspector Whitmore burst through the library doors at the head of a group of constables, their uniforms a welcome sight after the nightmare of the past few minutes. Behind them came a man I recognized as Chief Inspector Morrison from Scotland Yard, whose presence indicated that my case had been taken very seriously indeed. "Your Grace, step away from the Duchess immediately," Inspector Whitmore commanded, his service revolver drawn and aimed with professional steadiness. "You are under arrest for the murders of Isabelle Blackwood and numerous others, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice." Edward straightened to his full height, every inch the aristocrat even in the face of ruin and disgrace. "You have no idea what forces you are choosing to challenge, Inspector. The Blackwood family has survived wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of governments. We will survive this temporary inconvenience as well." "Perhaps," Inspector Whitmore replied calmly, "but you will do so from prison, where you belong." As the constables moved to arrest my husband, I finally allowed myself to lower the pistol, my hands shaking with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. The long nightmare was over at last, though I knew the legal proceedings ahead would be complex and possibly dangerous as other members of the conspiracy moved to protect themselves. 3 months later, I stood in the witness box at the Old Bailey, giving testimony that would help convict Edward Blackwood of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. The trial had become a sensation, with newspapers throughout England following every detail of the case that had exposed one of the most shocking criminal conspiracies in British history. Edward himself maintained his aristocratic demeanor throughout the proceedings, showing no remorse for his crimes and expressing only contempt for a justice system he considered beneath his station. The evidence I had gathered, combined with Inspector Whitmore's thorough investigation, proved overwhelming. Several accomplices among the household staff and local officials were also convicted, while the scandal destroyed the social standing of numerous families who had been complicit in covering up the truth over the years. As for myself, I found that surviving such an ordeal had changed me in fundamental ways. The naive young woman who had walked down the aisle at Ravenshollow Manor no longer existed, replaced by someone harder and more determined, someone who understood that justice sometimes required personal sacrifice and considerable courage. Inspector Whitmore had become a frequent visitor during the months of preparation for the trial, his professional admiration gradually deepening into something more personal. Unlike my disastrous marriage to Edward, this relationship was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to truth and justice. When he proposed to me on a quiet afternoon in my father's garden, I accepted with a heart finally free from the shadows of Ravenshollow Manor. We were married in a simple ceremony attended only by family and close friends, a celebration of genuine love rather than social advancement. As we exchanged vows, I thought of Isabelle and all the other women whose voices had been silenced by Blackwood violence. Their deaths had finally been answered, their stories told, their truth acknowledged by a world that had ignored their suffering for far too long. The locket that had started my journey toward the truth now rests in a place of honor in my new home. a reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried and that the dead sometimes find ways to guide the living toward justice. Ravenshollow Manor itself stands empty now, its dark corridors echoing with the ghosts of centuries past, waiting for someone brave enough to transform it from a monument to evil into something that serves the cause of good. I have no doubt that Isabelle's spirit has found peace at last, her mission finally accomplished through my hands and Inspector Whitmore's dedication to justice. The woman in blue no longer haunts my dreams, though sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light falls just right, I fancy I can see her smiling from the shadows, grateful that her story has finally been told and her murderer brought to account for his crimes.